Hi. So I found out recently that those of us who attend the IETF and are mere observers and then kibitz about it afterward are actually called tourists. And I took this self-portrait in December, so I couldn't help myself. So I don't know if it's going to permanently be called the IETF tourist, but I just thought it was hilarious that I'm known as a tourist. I used to not be an IETF tourist. I actually used to write stuff, and maybe I will again, but we'll see. Anyway, I just thought it was entertaining, so I'm the tourist. Let's see. So about the presentation, you guys have all probably, most of you have seen this before. It's just a little disclaimer. Before I go to the next slide, this was probably the most popular slide of my last IETF report, and I've, in an effort to be more diverse, I've included women's shoes from the IETF because there are some, and they're very stylish. So there's some really poorly styled male shoes as well as some really stylish women that also attend the IETF. We're 9% of the population, but we're mighty. So I don't know, it's not, okay. Also, I'm not sure, I don't know if I consider this to be a highlight of the trip, but Scott Bradner is also retiring from the IETF work that he does, and we all know him from here, and we miss him a lot. But Yari put up the next slide at the plenary, and I couldn't help myself. This is what the press is saying about Scott Bradner, the mother of consensus. So a round of applause for Scott. Because
I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you need to explain that that's Huan Zhao, who is the head of the Secretary General of the ITU? You can imagine how welcome he might be in an IETF meeting.
Actually, he gave a really good presentation in Yokohama, though. He was really well spoken. So anyway. So thanks to ARIN, one of the side things I got to do while I was at the Yokohama IETF in November was to go to Iwate and to give a talk to a bunch of students at my girlfriend's graduate class. And they loved that I brought them stickers. So that was pretty awesome. Also, for those of you, I've decided, you know, if there's something, like there's some things I'm going to talk about later, if there's something that you think the IETF should be working on or something you think I should report on, I'm always happy to try to squeeze myself into one of those working groups if I don't already, so just let me know. It's a two-way thing. I also added a couple of slides that weren't at the IETF, but yet I heard about them around the IETF, and I think they're pretty interesting, so bear with me. I'll go as fast as I can. It's now the Internet Engineering Travel Forum, which I love. There's also been a lot of discussions at the plenary at IETF about where to physically have meetings and whether all the venues are welcoming to all the attendees of the particular meetings. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, there's a lot going on with the IETF starting to define what are the criteria we use to pick a venue, that sort of thing. I'm not sure that, well, anyway. Another highlight, there's a lot of Yang models. Not sure how exciting they are, but there's a lot of Yang models. They're data models for NetConf. So we'll be talking not a lot about them, but there's a lot of references to them. So if you're interested in data models, check it out. This is a link that came up right around the time I left for the IETF, and it's actually a pretty good article that you could have used to describe the IANA transition to your relatives, which some of us have a hard time doing, right? Like, what do? Your relatives don't know what you do. You have to explain it. So check it out if you're interested. It's actually a pretty good article. Okay, so right before I left for the IETF in November, I got a question from the community about adding to RFC 1918 space with blocks that aren't routed, like the Department of Defense, the European Department of Defense, and I thought the world had gone mad. So when I went to the IETF, I asked a lot of internet service providers whether they were doing this, and a lot of them said, of course we're doing that. And I wrote a blog entry for Team ARIN about this. So if you're thinking of doing such a thing, or if you're already doing it, you might want to read the blog article because it's actually really dangerous. If that block starts being globally routed and you're using it as private address space, then you'll not be able to get to it, and it's you have to readdress really fast. Anyway, I mean, I see the reason why someone might want to do it, but not a good idea. Anyway, so that was one of my little adventures at the November IETF, was to ask people if they are really doing that, and they are. Crazy. The 2-byte and 4-byte ASN thing, so there's been a lot of discussion on the PPML about BGP communities and doing routing policy and not having the same functionality with 4-byte ASNs as 2-byte ASNs. And so there's some of us that are really interested, like find us, Aaron Hughes and I, in the hallway, if you have some feedback on that, whether we should work on a new RFC in the IETF to expand the expanded communities, because there is an RFC for expanded BGP communities, but they're not quite exactly like the 2-byte ones. And if that's really an impediment to deploying 4-byte ASNs, then maybe we should work on it in the next 5 years before we run out of 2-byte ASNs. Anyway, just some food for thought, which is really all I have time for, is food for thought. So the first thing that happens at the IETF is the IEPG, which is a bunch of operators that meet before the IETF, and the IETF really, most of them don't know about us. But we meet on Sunday from 10 to noon for the last 25 years, maybe. And it's usually the most exciting part of my week, and it happens on Sunday. So if you're interested at all, there's a web page with all the different presentations, and I'll be talking about some of them. So let's see. It's a shoe theme. So if you look at big data and .nl, there's a lot of the DNS there is being used to falsify, to counterfeit shoes, which I thought was pretty exciting. It's 40% of all their border seizures, and they're using the DNS legitimately for criminal purposes, which I thought was pretty interesting. And the presentation is great. Also, the V6 performance is better than V4 between the mobile LTE network and Facebook, which was pretty interesting. Let's see. So there's a lot of work being done doing DNS over TCP, because having that state means that you can have a little bit more stable connection doing DNS. So there was a pretty good talk about that. There was also a talk about what a router really does, which I thought was super fun at the IETF. But nonetheless, it was pretty interesting. Let's see. Why is it not going? There we go. So Jeff Houston gave a really great talk. We've seen little bits of it before, where he looks at the routing table and sees that the number of prefixes being added is like this consistent rate over time, and the number of ASs being added are at a consistent rate over time. And it's like clockwork. It's kind of amazing, actually. Even with depletion and people maybe using smaller and smaller prefixes, the routing table's been growing the exact same way for a while now. So there's some really interesting data that he has in his presentation. Let's see. There's a bunch of high-level domains that went away a long time ago, and they're still getting lots and lots and lots of queries. That's pretty much the summary of this. Like, old stuff never, ever goes away. So it's kind of scary, actually. Let's see. Oh, so this presentation, pretty interesting. I think there's like 2 takeaways. One, inter-RIO transfers they work pretty well. There's a little, extra work that has to happen. You can't transfer AS numbers. There's an interesting slide for those of you who are interested on an interesting description of the ARIN policy process, but if I start to describe it, I might not use language appropriate for this audience, so I won't. And there's some information in the presentation about changing the RPKI, which is the DNS, the security part of moving the address, not the DNS, moving the addresses from one registry to the other. So if you're interested in that, you can check out some real life experience. Let's see, encrypted DNS a year on, so is some information. These are just some more talks that were there that I don't actually have time to go into depth about, but these are the rest of the things that were presented at the IEPG. Let's see. So, Sunset v4, my all-time favorite draft ever. Thank you, Lee Howard, wherever you are. Everyone should applaud him. My favorite. Should we declare IPv4 historic? Favorite all-time draft. Because it's really starting to get people thinking about, what's the end game here? When people were asking it earlier, when do we decide that v4 is no longer relevant? What are the criteria for that? And it was a very lively discussion, super lively discussion. And we should not give folks the perception that the IETF has lost touch with reality. I'm not sure if that ship hasn't sailed already, but but in the back of the room, Jeff Houston and he was looking up drafts that should have been obsoleted long ago, like NetBugger 3. There's like a thing, RFC 162, NetBugger 3, that still is not historic. So, I know, and neither is Gopher. Go figure. I mean, Gopher is like 100 years ago, in dog years at least. For those of you who don't remember, it was, Gopher. Anyway, yeah, it was like way before search engines and dinosaurs roamed the earth. But it's still not obsolete, but we're going to obsolete IPv4. So anyway, but it's a really good draft, and it's really gotten people talking. And if you have feedback about what you think that the criteria should be, talk to Lee, because it's a really good thought exercise. Anyway, my all-time favorite. Okay, so V6 operations, I put this toward the front because there's a lot going on in there, and I'm supposed to be following V6, even though I kibitz about a lot of other things. So V6 ops is basically operational things to do with IPv6. I include little bits from the charter, so if you want to read more about what it is, it's always there. And there are actual real charters that are huge that you can. So this was such a cool talk. So I don't know how many of you remember, but there was a whole, these subnets in V6 are ginormous. And maybe you have 5 hosts over here, but somebody does a port scan and makes all your network roll over, and there's all the drafts about that. But this guy, he's doing this research with these trees, looking at where the address space is, so that you can find where the address space is. I don't know if that's really such a great idea to help the hackers, but it's also a really good idea to figure out where the address space is in all these humongous subnets that it might all be over here or over there. And it's a really interesting talk that he gave about that. I was fascinated. He took a big tree, and anyway, it was awesome. Let's see. What are we next? There's some drafts going on about whether it's better to have a V6 prefix per host as opposed to a whole bunch of hosts in the same V6 prefix, and whether that facilitates some new functionality. And it looks like one of the guys that works with Dan, John, was talking about how they're actually working on this at Comcast, and whether this is a good model for V6 over Wi-Fi. Anyway, it's pretty interesting stuff. And the draft that Vint and some other folks wrote is moving forward. It seems to have a lot of support, so I think it's going to probably end up being an RFC, which is all about host addressing and multiple addresses per host and that sort of thing. Let's see. This is a little bit of update on V6 deployment at Facebook. They presented, there's still quite a few issues. And as far as I know, aside from this, I don't think that some of the applications a lot of users use, I don't think Skype still does V6 and stuff like that. So, as we keep moving forward, still lots of things need to happen. This is all about enterprise design choices for V6. There's a draft that's moving through the process about that. So if you run an enterprise and you want to check it out, they're always looking for people to review the drafts. Let's see. Oh, the thing that's important on this draft for everyone here is that there's a lot of discussion in the IETF right now about provider aggregated or provider independent address space. And I'm not sure I'm really comfortable with internet drafts specifying PI or PA space, but they're starting to really talk about it. And I think as a community, we need to be paying attention to that and speaking up that, an address is really, from a standards point of view, in my opinion, an address is an address. And whether it's provider aggregatable or not, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm getting my head around that. So I've been kind of following along with that to see how it goes. But recommending PI space, that really has an impact on us as a registry and the routing table. So LACNIC, a fellow from LACNIC gave a talk about V6 deployment in South America. And there are 4 countries in South America that have V6 to the end user. And some of them not quite to the end user: Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. So in Argentina, for the IETF to have V6 connectivity, there was a tunnel because there is no V6 in Argentina. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done down there with V6 deployment. It's kind of shocking to me, actually. And they have a whole metric by gauging, the planning stages of all the different countries and how far along they are and whether they have any infrastructure and that sort of thing. So it's a really interesting presentation. We're just going to skim over this. This is stuff I've talked about in many other presentations, extension headers. You can get really, let's see, where am I? Why is it not? There we go. Okay, so 6-man is more of a working on the V6 specifications to make it work. And I don't have a whole lot. There's some drafts going on through 6-man. Somebody actually went to the mic and said, I'm not sure, I don't want to misspeak, so I'm going to go look it up before I say anything, which was a shocker. It's just a shocker. So he did. He went and looked up to make sure he wasn't asking the wrong question. Nobody ever does that at the IETF, but he did. He was super nice. So let's see. They're working on taking all the real-world experience and updating the IPv6 specification itself to look at, where we've come in the last 10 to 15 years, and then doing a new rev of the spec. And this is what all of this is about. So there's 4 different drafts that they're updating all at the same time to try to take everything we've learned so far and put it back into the spec. Oh, let's see. This is a draft about, there's a lot of problems with varying packet sizes on networks because the V6 is so much bigger. So they're looking at ways to negotiate to make the MTU bigger so that things don't get as fragmented. Let's see. HomeNet, my very favorite. So they're working in HomeNet to automate the home networking environment, sort of. I've talked about it a number of times with ridiculous diagrams and multiple routing protocols and all kinds of stuff. So this is what's going on in HomeNet. They picked a brand new routing protocol called Babel or Babel, depending on who you are, to be in the HomeNet. And I'm still really sort of on the fence about that. And then, of course, our quote about the CompuServe thing is probably why Vince's laughing. I'm not really sure. But they've decided that Babel is mandatory to implement as experimental. Not exactly sure what that means, but more on that later. Yeah, and then there's this, anyway, some of this stuff. This is all about Wi-Fi roaming and V6. So they took this protocol that no one's actually using called Babel, and they're going to put it in home network. So they're looking at, it's not really very specified. It's not an RFC. And so they're looking at what does HomeNet need so that Babel will work in home networks. I'm not even really sure why they would pick a protocol that no one's actually using yet, but it's supposed to do source routing, and everybody seems to want that. I feel like it's not ready. That's my little personal opinion there. There's a naming architecture for HomeNet, and that's one of my favorite quotes. So if my host is named banana.homenet, and your host in your house is named banana.homenet, how do we secure the DNS, and how do I know that you're not me? So they're still working on that. I don't know how many people are going to carry their host to their neighbor's house, but apparently it's a big deal. Let's see. More on the naming architecture. These are some more drafts that are going through HomeNet. So there was actually, they're taking Babel now, and they're going to try to make it an internet standard. And there were a bunch of guys who presented who said, I implemented that in a day. I implemented it in 2 days. And one of the developers sitting next to me said, you can write it in a day, but it takes a lifetime to debug it. And that's pretty much true. So we'll see how that goes with Babel in the home. And there's some more information about it. It's a distance vector protocol, not unlike RIP, which we probably should be using. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop. So there are multiple implementations. I'm still on the fence about it. Okay, so the other thing I've been following at the IETF is this human rights on the internet, how protocols facilitate or impede human rights on the internet, which I think is just absolutely fascinating, because I never really thought about it before I started going to the IETF. So they made a movie. They interviewed a lot of folks in the community, and they made a movie that I have a link to on my slides. I think it might be on the next slide, about that very topic. And it's actually really good. Maybe not, the cast may not be as diverse as one might hope, but the film is interesting. And it's a good thought process of whether, the freedom of association and those sorts of things are facilitated or hindered by the net. So you should check it out, because it actually is really interesting. I have to figure out why my slides go off the bottom. Maybe I put too much stuff on them. This guy is so cool. He wrote a programming language in Arabic. Okay, think about that. It's not ASCII. And he looked at all the different things that break if you try to have a programming language in a non-ASCII, or I'm grasping for the wrong word, but anyway, in a language that is not Latin characters. Thank you, but I couldn't quite grasp it. And he also has this really cool blog, and one of the titles of one of his entries was like, nope, still not Arabic. Like, there's all this stuff out there on the web that looks like Arabic, but it's actually just gibberish. So, and he gets these people that come across his site, and they're so excited. They're young kids, and they speak Arabic, and they're so excited that they might get to program in their language, and they can't. Like, it didn't actually work. The whole process didn't work because the whole computer, everything is American English and ASCII. So they have to actually learn a whole nother language to become a programmer. It was a really interesting thought process, really, the whole human rights thing. But anyway, I'm going to start following his blog because I think it's awesome. This is a multi-stakeholder process document that somebody wrote as their thesis that I'm like halfway through reading it. It's pretty interesting. You should check it out. It sort of analyzes what we do here at, the whole bottom-up, or bottoms-up, as somebody used to say, bottom-up process that we use to set policy and what it means and the ins and outs of it and that sort of thing. It's pretty cool. So the IANA transition, with respect to the IETF, we do quite a bit of talking about it here at ARIN, is mostly done. They're just working on intellectual property rights of who owns what and the interaction between the trust and the IETF and the IANA and the trademarks and that sort of thing. But mostly they consider it to be well on its way, which is kind of nice. I think we're kind of almost there here too. So there was a BOF about intelligent transportation systems, which terrifies me. Like, your car's talking to the car next to you. Can I follow you? How fast are you going? Kind of creepy. I don't know. And then the network in your car with all your passengers talking their PDAs because they can't actually turn across and talk to each other. They've got to use their computers to talk to each other. So there was a bunch of use cases or some documents. I'm not really sure I want that in my car. I like my adaptive cruise control, but I don't want to talk into your car. Just don't want that. Can't go there. There's a draft that Yari just wrote, and this is sort of the non-standards bits of IETF, which is pretty interesting. They're doing a lot of work on diversity and all kinds of stuff, and he wrote a really interesting draft about all of that. So this is some interesting work that's starting to look at all the different ways that we use names in the internet that aren't necessarily in the DNS, like .onion for Tor, which is a big encrypted network, a privacy anonymous network that is used a lot, and how to incorporate those and make it so that there's not just a ton of failed DNS attempts, for example, and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of work being done. They might form a working group, but right now they're just sort of talking about what are all the different naming things that are used in the internet, and what do we do with them, and how do we reconcile them? Because there's a lot of non-existent domain stuff that's happening for these things that shouldn't ever really be in the DNS. This is policy abstraction language, and guess what? There are Yang models in here. There's a whole lot of Yang models. I went to this on the way to something else. I'm not going to talk about it very much, but there's a lot of work being done to abstract data information on the internet. Some drafts, why it's valuable. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not going to really talk about T's too much, but there's a whole traffic architecture and signaling work going on, traffic engineering. And there's some Yang models there too. And some drafts that are happening in that area. Not very IPv6, and secure telephony. I think I talked about that a while before. So there's some drafts going on there. So GROW is the Global Routing Operations Group, which I like to follow because I used to do routing, a lot of routing. And Jared has a really interesting draft trying to make BGP come up and behave and not just start advertising everything by default. And fixing some things like that so that you don't accidentally announce the whole world when you shouldn't. Maybe you do that on purpose, but not by accident. Would be kind of nice. And there's a work being done on a black hole BGP community to mitigate different kinds of attacks and things. I went to a meeting early one morning. Early in Argentina is before 10 a.m. because the meeting didn't start till 10 a.m. because you can't get breakfast before 9 a.m. and you can't get lunch before 12:30 or 1, and dinner never ends until midnight. But anyway, I went to a meeting so the IETF is different than ARIN, and at the IETF they do meetings in other regions to facilitate the people who actually do IETF work in those regions. So not as outreach, but to go, oh, well, there's a whole lot of people that do work in China, for example. So maybe we should have a meeting in that region to help those people not have to always travel to Minnesota, because we used to have a lot of meetings in Minnesota. So we ended up with a meeting in Argentina because a lot more people from South America and Latin America had started participating, so they had a meeting in Argentina. So there's a group of folks that are trying to make a meeting happen in Africa, and in order to do that, they need to get a lot more participation from Africa. So they had a meeting to talk about, how do we do that? And there's all these remote hubs that are happening so you can participate virtually, and there's a really, really good remote participation at the IETF, and people actually ask their questions. You can see their face, and you hear them talk, which is really nice. So I went to the meeting, and it was really interesting. I'm on the mailing list now, so we'll see what comes of it. But, they're down there. They're mostly network operators. They're not really hardware developers right at this point in their history. So there, and we always need to get more operators involved in the IETF. So really trying to work on ways to make that happen. So we'll see how that goes. I was really disappointed to miss Andy Newton's talk at CIDR, but I was listening to the talk about IPv6 deployment in South America at the same time. But Andy has a draft written with some other folks, and he gave a talk that had a quite lively discussion at the end that I mostly missed, unfortunately. These are some of the other things that are going on in CIDR, which is secure interdomain routing. I don't know if anybody who listened to Andy's talk wants to comment about, John Curran.
So the engineering teams of the 5 RIRs put together a draft regarding CIDR trust anchors, or RPKI trust anchors. Basically, we've noted in the past that the validation algorithm for RPKI is fragile in the cases of overclaiming. And instead of invalidating just the overclaimed resource, it invalidates the entire set of resources signed by that certificate. So when we're doing transfers, we end up with certificates that have the potential that as we're moving something to another RIR, one RIR may have, 2 RIRs may be claiming the same resource. That would invalidate all the resources under an RIR certificate authority. And we pointed this out to the IETF, and they have interesting reasons why they don't want to change it. RPKI is a proper subset of PKI, and PKI has rules for how things are trusted, and this would require either changing those rules or making an exception for RPKI. So to make RPKI less fragile while we're deploying it, because we're supposed to be improving the internet, not breaking it, the RIRs will all work on a trust anchor that is universal. It's a 0/0 trust anchor, all 5 RIRs. Each of us will only sign our own resources, but there'll be no chance of an invalid certificate where an RIR is overclaiming a resource and therefore invalidating all of its customers. We said this is the only way we see that RPKI is actually deployable, and wrote that up in a draft and provided it to the IETF, where it had a warm reception at the CIDR working group. But they understand, and in fact, there's discussions now about the working group taking on the document as a working group document. And so that's a good thing. We're just trying to maintain the communication between the people who work on the protocol with the people who actually have to make it work for you. And it's an ongoing process, I guess.
Cool. So let's see, where are we? Yeah, so here's the information about the draft. Thanks, John. So here's some references, how to get involved if you want to, that sort of thing, upcoming BOFs. Let's see. There's also a really great video about how to get involved and the culture clash of interacting with IETF people. That's pretty good if you're ever going to go to an IETF. If you're a woman and you're going to the IETF, there's the IETF sisters, and if you're a man, all the mailing lists are for you anyway, so it's all good. We have a great group of women that get together now. There's like, I don't know, 40 of us all in one room sometimes. It's really cool. So anyway, does anybody have any questions? This is from my neighborhood last Monday night.
Jason
Go ahead, Jason.
Schiller, ASOAC. One comment, one question.
Yeah.
My understanding with regard to Lee Howard's Sunset v4 draft is to stop doing protocol development for IPv4 and only do protocol development for IPv6.
That is one of the intents, as I understand it. When you make a draft historic, it really pretty much stops most of the work. I mean, the IETF can still do whatever it wants to do. So if somebody writes a draft and it gets past the powers that be, it could probably still happen. But yeah, it's sort of phasing it out, so to speak.
And I also noted in your slide there was some discussion about ULA. Was ULA Central ever a topic of discussion? If so, I think this community would be very interested.
I don't recall it this time. Certainly, I think that it has been discussed. But, Alain?
Alain, I can. You had a slide on squatting on RFC 1980
Right.
private space. You went very quickly. Would you mind expanding a little bit on it?
Expanding on it?
Yeah, I was not there, so I mean.
Oh, yeah, certainly. There's before I left for the IETF, I was asked about what the best block would be to pick to use of the non-routed /8s to add to RFC 1918 space, like net 20 or net 30, and I didn't know people were doing that, so I spent a bunch of time at the IETF asking about it. And a lot of service providers are doing it, and I wrote a blog about it for Team ARIN because it's very concerning because A, the blocks don't belong to you, B, if somebody starts globally routing them, you have to instantly readdress everything on your network that's using that address or no one will be able to get to it. We'll be able to get to the legitimate users of the address space. So, but it's being done a lot, like a lot. And in my blog entry, I posted a bunch of, I Googled it because, I'm not going to name names, but I posted a ton of online stuff that people had talked about using it. Or there's also a big conspiracy. People do a trace route, they see the Department of Defense address in their trace route and they think they're being surveilled, even though it's just somebody using address space as RFC 1918 space. But in Team ARIN, my blog has a bunch of links you can read about all the different service providers that are using this address space and basically squatting on it for more RFC 1918 space. I'm not sure if that answered your question. But.
Yes, thank you. And a follow-up question is, are there people who are proposing to write a draft to say which block to squat? Or conversely, is there a proposal to write a draft saying squatting considered harmful?
I think it would be awesome if there was a draft that said it's considered harmful. And I also think, though, that if a bunch of service providers got together and went to the U.S. Department of Defense or one of these organizations and said, it's to your benefit to announce that you're never going to globally route this, because the more people who are using it as squat space, the less likely it is that you're going to ever be able to get to the real addresses on that block, right? So if they're never really going to announce it, it's actually to their benefit to announce that they're not ever going to announce it. But now that address space is worth money, there's a big block everyone has been using. It's a European block that was going to become publicly available on the routing table, and everybody was scrambling to try to move out of it. So I don't know if that happened or not, but it would be, I think an operational draft might be a great idea for that. So,
Thank you.
David?
David Huberman, Oracle, and former squatter.
I wasn't going to call you out.
Sorry. This is one of these things where if you're an IETF outsider, like I am, you look at the IETF and say, what have you been doing all these years? National telcos in other parts of the world outside of the United States and Canada, and cable companies now in the United States and all over the world, and large enterprises. Enterprise network is like really important in the enterprise now. It used to be, right? You have these really large enterprises, and they happen to have an architecture that's a single AS. And you put all these different users together, and you realize RFC 1918 was never large enough.
Right.
It was never going to scale to this. So rather than saying, maybe it's a really good idea if the IETF puts an information out that says this is a bad idea, maybe we ought to concentrate those efforts on finding an engineering solution for folks who need to bootstrap to V6 but have literally run out of 1918. Because right now, squat space is it.
Right.
D is no good and E doesn't work.
Right, but V6 does, but it's another hurdle.
It's
Right.
a big hurdle. At the scale you're talking about, it's years of effort and it's years of capital, and we're going to get there.
Right.
But what do we do today?
So I am going to close the mics very shortly for sake of everyone, but if you're in now, in the queues, that's fine. You've got
I'm
people
super
down here.
excited to have a line at the mics. It's the first time. Ben?
So Kevin Bloomberg, just
Oh,
to
Kevin.
expand a little bit on that, the warning shot has already happened with the squatting space. 20 years ago when somebody said in a boardroom, let's squat on this, it's low risk. Well, the UK government has started selling off
Okay,
their
that-
IP assets.
okay, they did,
And
yeah.
there's already been known instances where this has affected people who have squatted the space internally. So that low risk in the boardroom from 10, 15 years ago is now becoming very high risk to organizations.
Right. Then,
You know, I wonder whether the Defense Department might decide to use the address space for routing drones. You might not
Right.
want to be in the target area of those addresses.
Owen?
Owen DeLong, ARIN AC, Akamai. For those whining about RFC 1918 is not large enough, guess what? V4 is not large enough. Move on.
Anyway, but it is a bad idea. So just, I mean, like, yeah. Anyway,
A round of applause for Kathy for her
thanks, you
report.
guys.